On today's Substance Stories, we're going to be talking about what to do if your family member has an addiction, how you can help them, and navigate some of the common pitfalls. So today, Fergal, we're going to do a request from a patient's family member that I talked to who said that they loved the podcast, but they wanted to know more about what they should do, how they can help their loved one with an addiction. So this is
that's the $1 million question, isn't it? You know,
it is
to watch a loved one slip away from you into the arms of addiction is probably the most horrible thing that I can imagine happening to me, anyway. And it's a very common request from the relatives of patients that we have. You know, how do we actually help? How do we help relatives help patients?
Yeah.
Have you got any thoughts on the issue? I'm sure you have.
I do. Well, I'm going to refer you to some pre-prepared thoughts. So I guess the first thing, and what you and I have talked about before, is the best way you can help a loved one with an addiction is to preemptively have a fantastic relationship with that person, have an open and honest relationship where we can speak openly. We know that there's pure love between us. That is the most fantastic way to prevent an addiction and to help a loved one with an addiction, is to be close with them and let them feel they can be talked to.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that when you are asking me for advice about what to do with your loved one for an addiction and me saying, well, you should have had a better relationship with them for the last 10 years is not a very useful response. So I'm going to give some actual practical steps and why I think these steps are. So Fergal, I'm going to start off with the sick role. So the sick role is from Emil Durkheim, who's a sociologist, basically invented sociology. What is the sick role?
Well, it's that attitude or that mindset that says, I'm sick, therefore I'm entitled to positive reinforcement, i.e.
I'm going to cut you off there because you've got a broad idea, but actually Durkheim was very clear about what the sick role was. There were four key points.
Well,
so the
tell
sick
me
role,
what
we
the
have
sick
rights.
role is.
We have rights and
make sure you talk
responsibilities.
about positive and negative reinforcement of the sick role.
So this is just defining the sick role. Okay, so there are rights and responsibilities. And I guess what you've highlighted there is actually doctors aren't fully, because when we talk about sick role in medical, doctors are often talking about sort of abnormal sick role behavior. That is behavior that does not fit within the sick role. But the sick role is a defined process. So the sick role is you have rights and you have responsibilities. So your rights are, so I beg your pardon, just to separate the sick role, we're not talking about being ill. So if I get ill with pneumonia and end up in hospital, I am unwell. That is not a socially defined role. That is being unwell. The sick role is the socially defined role that comes along with being unwell. And so it's got rights and responsibilities. The rights are, I am not responsible for my illness. So I didn't get myself unwell. I don't want to be unwell. The second one is, I don't have to do my normal duties of fatherhood, husbandhood, workhood. The responsibilities I have is I must be working towards getting better, and I must be following the advice of medical professionals telling me to get better, essentially. So it's really, sometimes it's limited. It's turned into three, because you could say those two responsibilities are basically the same thing. But Durkheim was originally four, and I guess it's to say, well, I could be trying to get better, but I could be going down I could be taking ivermectin for COVID is abnormal sick role behavior. So what you, I think, jumping on there, Fergal, is abnormal sick role behavior is when I don't play by those rules. Either I go to work with a cold and get everyone in the office sick, or I don't try and get better. So people don't bring up the sick role enough with addiction, but I think it's really
there's more to it than that, Richard. The sick role, surely we need to address the issue about how some people want to play the sick role because of the tender loving care that they get. And that's positive reinforcement. And then the negative reinforcement of the sick role also involves the abrogation of personal responsibility. I think those you alluded, or those issues have been alluded to in those definitions.
That is abnormal sick role behavior. So what you're alluding to there would be someone that isn't trying to get better. So that is abnormal sick role behavior. But what I'm talking about is, and that's a different podcast for a different time. What I'm talking about now is specifically the sick role in terms of when we get unwell, because it's really key to think about addiction like any other chronic illness. So I often use diabetes like addiction. So someone with diabetes is not responsible for having diabetes, but they are responsible for seeking help. If I have an addiction, I'm not responsible for seeking the addictive behavior, but I am responsible for seeking help for my addictive behavior. And it's the same way if I had diabetes, I'm not responsible for having diabetes, but I am responsible for following medical advice and not eating 20 pavlovas. So I think this is what I...
Here's an interesting question, right? I'm not responsible for my illness. That's a very interesting question, isn't it? Or it's an interesting statement. There are some that would suggest that most acquired illnesses, i.e. non-congenital, there is some personal responsibility for the acquisition of that illness.
Yeah, this is...
Let's talk about diabetes. Let's talk about type 2 diabetes.
So again, Fergal, and I just because I want to keep this limited, because this is about how so I guess that would be an interesting conversation for another time. But I guess how I'd sum that up, just to cut you off and to keep on going the pathway I'm going, I would say that this isn't about the blame game. I don't find any usefulness in talking about who's to blame for an illness, because we are looking to how to get better from that illness. So why I bring up the sick role today to talk about families is that families often take on a role where they're trying to punish the person for engaging in that addictive behavior, and they're trying to take on the role of a doctor. And so diabetes is or a clinician. The diabetes is a perfect example, because if I had diabetes and my wife said to me I had to get a blood sugar below a certain amount, that would be ludicrous. I would say that's a conversation for my endocrinologist. Or she said, I'm going to help you get your blood sugar low. But if I have that's a very routine thing with an addiction. So I think it's important to not let, when we're the family members, to have a boundary where we are. We're a supporting service for people with an addiction. We aren't the treating clinicians. All that's going to do is drive a wedge into our relationships. But
so can you explain more how relatives can act as clinicians in this situation?
Well, relatives can try and provide counselling, can try and hold their family members to, check in on how much they're drinking and try and talk to them about it. Talk to them about why they're not doing things that they think should be helpful. These are all roles that I would say are clinician roles. And if relatives, family members try and take on that role, there's going to be a negative, it's going to impact the quality of the relationship, and it's going to deprive that person that's suffering from an addiction from a loved one who really should be providing support and care, emotional support and care, rather than medical advice. And I think that... So
what you're saying, just an example of some of the care that we would provide would be motivational interviewing, getting people to the point of accepting change and accepting the possibility of recovery. So you're saying that relatives should avoid that entirely?
Absolutely. But then that is not to say that relatives have no role in terms of they should just let it go free rein. And I'm going to bring it back to the sick role in terms of, if I have an addiction, it isn't my fault. And I strongly believe it's not my fault. I don't believe it's the fault of people who with an addiction having an addiction. It's not my fault if I have an addiction, but it is my responsibility to seek help. So if I had an addiction and my wife, it's not her role to be constantly questioning. Let's say I was addicted to opioids, whether I've had opioids, how much I'm using, but it is her it is my responsibility to be seeking help. And it is a perfectly reasonable statement of her to be saying, are you going to see your addiction specialist? Are you seeing your counselor regularly? Are you going to AA? And if those boundaries are crossed from her perspective, she is perfectly within her right to say, I'm sorry, Richard, you can no longer, if you want to continue being my husband, I expect you to be going to these, going to AA, going to, or NA rather, if it was opioids, going to your addiction specialist, going to your counselor, regularly seeing your GP. Even if I don't have an addiction, my view would be I have a chronic relapsing remitting condition, and that requires ongoing support throughout my life, like someone with diabetes. So it is our responsibility to be seeking help. But in that same way, it is not as soon as my wife starts saying, if you use, I'll kick you out, not only is that unjust, because it's not my fault for having an addiction, but it's also going to lead to more compartmentalizing and more lying. So my second question, and you did so well with what a sick role is, so I'm really expecting high things. Why did the Roman Republic fall apart?
Well, there is a theory that suggests the Roman Republic fell apart because of fast women and loose horses.
Yes, it's very much
There is a,
taking the Augustan view about the Roman Republic. But I
there is
guess
another theory. There is another theory that the Roman Republic fell because it wasn't able to. Its economy wasn't able to support its military to expand.
and again,
And
you've
really,
wonderfully
when
gone
any
down
major empire,
you've
you
wonderfully gone
asked me
down
the
a path
question,
I don't
Richard.
want you to, so I'm going to cut you off again because this is not a history of the Roman Republic podcast. I guess in my mind, it fell apart because Julius Caesar didn't want to go back to Rome without his army. And why didn't he want to go back to Rome without his army? Because when he left office, he was going to get persecuted for crimes when he was in office. So they were creating an incentive for him to never leave office, right? Much like why you don't go after former presidents who might have broken the law, with the same idea, because when they get back into power, they don't want to leave office. So my view here would be any boundary that I put in with a loved one. So let's say we'll reverse it. Let's say it's my wife with the addiction. If I say to her, if you use opioids, you can't be in the house, all I am doing is encouraging her to lie to me about her use. And that is never a boundary we should put in place. Any boundary we should put in place, we should be very aware of what we are incentivizing. And we need to create an environment with our loved ones where they are always open to share with us their struggles and we can support them. So I believe I'm perfectly within my right to say to my wife, if you do not continue to see this addiction specialist, if you do not continue to do the advice of the doctor, and I want to occasionally go to yours because I'm your loved one and I want to provide support, then I'm not comfortable with you being in the house. But I never want to be in a scenario. I never think we should be putting in boundaries where we're incentivizing our loved ones to lie to us. And that's what I see so often with people who have a loved one with an addiction, is that they are incentivizing them to lie to them. Is that something you've seen, Phil?
All the time. And this, if you use one more time, you're kicked out. And another thing that I see is if you fail to complete detox or a period of hospitalization or rehabilitation, if you fail to complete that, then you cannot come home. That is a very frustrating challenge that I, as an admitting clinician, have to meet frequently. It just doesn't help.
No, and I think whenever we're putting in boundaries, and this one, it is really helpful, and I really recommend people to go see a separate counselor, addiction specialist that's not known to your loved one for advice, because it can be really hard to find these boundaries, because people are always worried about enabling or so far punishing someone that they're encouraging the addiction, right? And finding that boundary is really hard to find. But whenever we're putting in a boundary, we should be asking ourselves, am I punishing this person for having an illness? So it's not in this scenario we're giving, it's not my wife's fault that she has an addiction and is engaging in that addiction behavior. That is rule one of the sick role. It is not our fault for being sick, but I am responsible for seeking help. And I think that is the line to always draw when we are helping our loved ones. It is not our fault that we have an addiction. It is our responsibility to seek help.
On that note, is there a role in advising families in terms of not facilitating the addiction? So, for instance, I have patients, I see relatives of patients who will actually pay money to the patient to buy drugs, or will actually go and buy the drugs for the patient.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
No. That is unacceptable behavior. That is encouraging an addiction in the same way that if I had diabetes, I wouldn't expect you to go out and buy me 20 Mars bars. Right. So I don't think that's the case. There'd be rare examples, perhaps with a dangerous withdrawal, where if I had a withdrawal detox planned, then I would advise family members to buy that person alcohol over the next couple of days to make sure that they don't go into a dangerous withdrawal. But that sort of thing needs to be done with the advice of an addiction specialist.
So that's one of the motivators for relatives to actually source medication, source drugs, is that they don't want their loved one to go into withdrawal. So, for instance, if a loved one is sick and physically cannot get to their dealer, then should the relative watch their loved one suffer from a withdrawal and be sick at the same time, or should the loved one go and get the drugs from the dealer?
Well, that is what we'd call in psychology a false dilemma. where I think there are third options there. For instance, entering a detox facility. If you are in a life-threatening withdrawal, you can always go to your local emergency department and explain the situation and safely withdraw in hospital.
Yeah. So there's actually a range of kind of what I describe as degrees of enmeshment into someone's addiction. The range starts off with actually buying the drugs, through to saying that, if you use under the premises, then I'm going to kick you out, through to the relationship is over entirely. I tend to say to people that I tend to advise people not to make life-changing decisions from positions of stress or weakness. How can you tell if someone says to you, is my relationship over? Is this patient going to get better? What would you say to that?
I think that's very, very complicated. I think everyone with an addiction has a good chance to get better. I think, and I want to recap there, I think in terms of enmeshment and enabling, by far, it's very rare I meet a family scenario where I think that this family is encouraging or enabling the family member with an addiction's use. It's almost always, I believe, the family are being too robust and further encouraging the use by removing love and support from their life. I think that love and connection and support are unbelievably key to recovery from addiction, and in 99% of the time, that is what's going on. In the 1% of the time where it is about enabling, where I do feel it's enabling, I think that that is a very tricky thing, and often there are some interesting sort of personality vulnerabilities. And sometimes I have recommended in those rare circumstances that they should look to end that relationship because it's not healthy for both people involved. But for the most part, I never advocate for the ending of a relationship with a loved one, because a loved one, that's what life is about to me. It's about family and social connections.
Yeah.
With the caveat that if someone is ever violent or aggressive to you, that is a line that has been crossed and that relationship has to end. And I have advised patients in my clinic that that their relationship with their loved one has to end because they have been violent to them or they have been violent. That is a line that has been crossed, and that is, to me, over. I don't believe that relationships should continue beyond that line being crossed.
That's a big issue. The issue of substance use and gendered family violence. But before we go on to that, I'd like to just bring up bring up a point about Johann Hari's statement, going back to you and love. The opposite of addiction is not abstinence, but it is social connection and love.
Absolutely. I think I would expand on Johann's point there. I think it's social connection, love, it's meaning and purpose. It is finding adaptive coping mechanisms to replace the maladaptive coping mechanism that is our addiction. So I don't think I would limit to just our social connections. I would also expand it to our meaning and purpose. But I hope this has been helpful. I hope this has addressed the request of the family member of a patient of mine. And if you would like anything else covered, please do reach out to us. That's all for today on Substance Stories. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much, Virgil, for being here with me.